in the southern, and they're also avoiding reporting what's happening in the southern hemisphere. Namely, we've had record cold in Australia, is well known to some, but not well publicised.
ADAPT 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather pattern. Magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Piers Corbyn, astrophysicist of Weather Action Long Range Forecasters. As we all know, the Earth's climate is driven by a Sun-Earth magnetic connectivity, the solar theory, but at the same time, he also uses SLAT, Solar-Lunar-Action-Technique. Now, this gives a new improved Northern Hemisphere summertime. There's different rules to clarify, and looking back at older data with lunar effects, which a lot of people don't take into consideration. Now, there's going to be a deluge of climate hype as we go deeper into the grand solar minimum, and the IPCC and the UN Climate Committee are deliberately ignoring or at least covering up some of the climate data. You know, we have the hurricane activity linked to solar cycles. Earthquakes are triggered by solar activity. We have the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillations. There's so many other things going on in the climate system. Atlantic Ocean temperatures drive weather in Europe. Atlantic Ocean temperatures with the pulse water under the Arctic ice in 9-year cycles. There's so much going on that the mainstream media doesn't take into consideration. And also, you know, Piers is peer-reviewed research, Journal of Atmospheric and Solar Terrestrial Physics. So, you know, when you hear somebody that has peer-reviewed research, this is a person you want to listen to. You can find the website weatheraction.com. He's also on Weather Action TV on YouTube. The K2P blog, that's ktwop.com. The Weather Action News blog, which is weatheraction.wordpress.com. We hosted Robert Felix and myself's interview on there as well. Thank you for putting that up. Mm-hmm. Also, you can find him at Twitter, Piers Corbyn, and also Facebook, Piers Corbyn. Thank you for joining me tonight. I know a lot of people have been waiting to hear what you have to say about all these changes we're witnessing based on the effects of the sun as we enter deeper into the grand solar minimum. Piers, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yes, and the Twitter address is at Piers_Corbyn, but if you just look for Piers Corbyn, you'll find it. Excellent. Well, yes, I think the important thing to understand is exactly as you said, that we are going deeper into a Maunder or Dalton type minimum, and that is making more extremes. But the mainstream media, and in particular the United Nations and the European Union with their global man-made climate change, global warming propaganda, want to hide what is going on. So right now they're talking about a northern hemisphere heat wave, which of course is complete nonsense. They're forgetting the fact that Europe is only a small part of the northern hemisphere. And of course there is heat in Japan, but there's also record cold levels in Russia in the last few weeks. So their claims are actually completely false. In fact, the northern hemisphere is at about very close to normal on the 30th of July, taking the daily means. And on the same day, the land temperature was about 0.2 degrees C below normal. So, you know, the claims are completely delusional and dishonest, and they're only reporting half of what's going on. And they're also avoiding reporting what's happening in the southern hemisphere. Namely, we've had record cold in Australia, is well known to some, but not well publicised. And in parts of South America, llamas have been dying off because it's just too cold. They can't take it. those things together are enough to make you realise there's something going on. The southern hemisphere as a whole, though, is at this point in time, curiously, warmer than normal under satellite data. But a large part of this is to do with the West Antarctica, which is relatively mild. And the reason for that is, of course, the undersea volcanoes there. There's a lot of undersea volcanoes in the whole world, and they are shooting off now. And in all the previous mini ice ages, there has been an upsurge in any true measure of surface temperature, or to bear in mind the fact that some of it is driven by things underneath.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. And I just did a video, the volcano that is erupting near Svalbard.
Yep.
The famous seed bank in Norway. They have the island
Absolutely.
off the northwest coast, and it's showing hot spots in the Arctic, 19 degrees Celsius water from 2 volcanic vents opening up on the Atlantic Ridge right there. Nobody's talking about that.
No.
I don't get it.
No. Well, they won't, because you see, they're desperate to defend their ideology. And if you look at the politics of it, the idea of man-made climate change is part of a big raft of ideology which is used to control people and exploit them, because it's a reason, a justification for increasing oil prices, because the oil companies say they go along with the man-made climate change theory as long as there is a uniform price for carbon across the board. And that is the actual quotes from, I think, the BP website. Now, farmers have been asked to burn food in the form of maize. So to make it worth a farmer to burn food rather than sell it, to burn maize rather than sell it, then he has to be paid a premium. And that means that all energy can go up by a premium. So basically the oil companies are doubling their profits at the expense of losing 2% of world trade to things like biofuels, wind farms and so forth. And it's a no-brainer. That's why the oil companies go along with it. And that's why OPEC, of course, works as hard as it can to increase prices. And interestingly, this disputes with Iran happening now with President Trump's sanctions is resulting in a oil price hike, which is, well, in the interest of those who want high oil price, which of course is the oil companies and, in fact, most of the American economy, because America is now an exporter of oil. Well, an exporter of energy in form of gas, that is, from fracking. I'm not commenting on whether it's right or wrong. Well, I mean, there are problems with shale when it gets to the water table
after they frack.
That is very dangerous. But, I mean, leaving aside the comments on goodness or badness, it's interesting to note that it is actually in the interest of the American economy to force up oil prices at this point in time.
Yeah, and I want to draw back in on when you were talking about wind and solar. Now, you saw there was a 40% decline across the UK due to lack of winds because of the high pressure cell over there. And then a month ago, we saw down in Australia, the Australian Super Freeze 1.0. There's been 2 Australian Super Freezes this season, if anybody wasn't aware of that. The first one sent frost to within 1,500 miles south of the equator. But when they tried to do that, people were paying, some of the larger producers, smelters, etc., they were because it was driven on solar and wind, they had a huge shortfall of electricity and electrical production. So some people were paying $14,000 per megawatt, which is ridiculous that they were trying to price people out of the market. Yeah, it came out to something like $14 for the average people to use down there at the time. And then the UK is experiencing the same thing. I mean, when do we really say, all right, this wind is not going to be reliable into the grand solar minimum? And with the cloudiness and the volcanic ash and the cosmic rays creating more cloud cover that we see in repeating patterns, these renewable energies just are going to start to fall apart as we get deeper in. I'm going to say, about 3 years, 4 years from now, we're going to start to really see the shortfalls of these renewable schemes that have been forced down our throats.
No, that is absolutely correct. Yeah, you see, whether or not we have a grand solar minimum, which we do have, of course, but the wind farms are a delusional concept, because when the wind doesn't blow, you've got to have backup. And the backup is normally a coal-fired power station. So it means you have to have inbuilt overcapacity, which of course is a waste of capital. And when you ramp up and down coal-fired power stations, they are actually producing more smoke. I mean, you can remove all the smoke with electrostatic precipitators, but it is more difficult to do that when temperatures are changing and so forth. So the whole thing is completely stupid. And the actual measures, I think it's worth people looking into this. measures of the CO2 produced with a wind farm shows that, when you make the wind farm, shows that in its normal life, it's quite arguable that the wind farm doesn't save any CO2 because of the huge amount of CO2 produced in building them and the long times they're not used. And the same with electric cars. It is absolutely crystal clear that electric cars produce more CO2 than equivalent petrol cars, because when you make those batteries and all the smelting that goes on to make the metals that go into those huge batteries, that produces as much CO2 as a typical petrol car will do in 8 years of driving. So you've got 8 years of driving your electric car before there's even a chance of reducing your so-called CO2 footprint. So, the whole thing really is run by and for, I would call, subsidy entrepreneurs who, have the green ideology there. They're promoted. It keeps people in order to do all sorts of things. Like in London, they're told to follow the Agenda 21 of living, which is putting people into smaller places. And they're forced to pay higher electricity charges, which of course means that the oil companies make bigger profits and various people who are making wind farms and solar panels and anything else subsidised to do things most of which are inherently stupid.
And then Agenda 2030, they had to push it back. But the whole concept is shoving people into shoeboxes, and that takes people even further away from the self-sustainability that we need to get into when we get into this grand solar minimum, because food crop losses or global crop losses, you're talking about farmers burning corn right now. We're going to need that corn for people to eat as our grain yields decline across the northern
Absolutely
hemisphere.
Correct.
And here we are putting people in shoeboxes, and nobody knows how to do anything. Nobody can grow anything, and it's almost forcing dependency on the system.
Well, I think that's what it's about. It is about forcing dependency on the system and also taking away people's cars. Now, there's pros and cons of cars, but I mean, quite frankly, I've got a car and it's very handy if you've got to, move children around or whatever. It's sometimes you have to have it if you've got to go a long distance. In America, of course, a car is even more completely necessary. But as I say, Agenda 21 is to force people out of cars, and it's definitely bad. And I think there's plenty of other things to talk about in terms of our forecasts and what is going on in the run-up to the mini ice age. But I think principal characteristics to understand about the mini ice age are the very long jet stream. So we've got a long jet stream which has huge waves in it. Now, this jet stream shape is completely the opposite of the warmest CO2 theory shape, because for them, you would have a generally warmer world, which means the jet stream is going to be in the northern hemisphere, further north, or further south in the southern hemisphere. Will be shorter, and it'll be less possible for it to actually wave, and it won't be very wavy. So you'll just have sort of boring hot summers with not much changes in them, and boring mild and wet winters with not too much change. And that is what their model is saying should have happened. Now, that is exactly what has not happened. They also said we'll see the end of snow and a reduction in, I know that is hilarious, isn't it? and a big increase in hurricanes in America. Now, they just whacked in these things because they sound desperately, well, they had a justification about warmer seas would make, more hurricanes sort of thing. Now, the connection is not that simple, but nevertheless, that's their argument. However, as you well know, we've had a drop of hurricanes, a drop of tornadoes in America, and we've definitely not seen the end of snow. We've had vast increases in snow all over the northern and central USA, even southern parts of the USA, and all over Europe and the British Isles. So their whole theory is not borne out by anything that happens. So instead they just say any extreme is a CO2 extreme. Now that is actually a complete lie. Now those of them who those actual honest meteorologists, well, I don't think there are any honest meteorologists in the global warming camp, but the meteorologists there do know that what's happening is not what they forecast. But of course they do have certain interest, so they'll just carry on saying that any extreme is a CO2 extreme. Whereas what actually is happening is what we warned of 10 years ago, and the specifics of events have been excellently forecast by our Solar-Lunar-Action-Technique, which has now reached SLAT 15A. These numbers and letters refer to certain modifications. And with this one, this summer in the Britain and Europe has been extremely well. Britain, Ireland, and Europe has been extremely well forecast. The heat waves have come when we said on time and persisted when we said, and they've been breaking down into big thunderstorms when we said as well. So we're extremely pleased with that. But you know, we don't get any publicity now on the BBC or the mainstream media. Sometimes you get a little bits on BBC Radio, but that's not Radio 4, which is the main one. It's just smaller local ones generally. So the Solar-Lunar-Action-Technique is going very well, and our mission now is to get out, and we put a statement on our website this morning about this on weatheraction.com, that the claims by the BBC, the European Union, the United Nations, various mainstream media, and now, of course, Facebook and Twitter are following explicitly and closing down climate realist accounts or limiting them. You know, their message is complete falsity, and we have to show this to people that it is complete falsity. And we want to also show that our forecasts work, and naturally enough, we need people to buy them in order to pay for our work and research. So anyone listening can do that. I know you've got some Australian listeners, and the good news for Australian listeners is we're getting, or have started to get, a group together of people who are supporting research with the intention of doing Australian forecasts with a trial for the coming Australian summer. We're asking people to buy some stuff online, and if you go just buy a British forecast, for example, and then can join a group, when you'll get free the trial Australian and New Zealand Southern Hemisphere summer forecasts, and after that you'll get reduced rates for the public production of ongoing forecasts if our trials work. So I'd urge anyone listening from Australia or New Zealand to pop along in there, have a look.
Yes, let's stay down in the Southern Hemisphere. So in your opinion, do you think in this current intensifying eddy grand solar minimum, do you feel that the Southern Hemisphere is leading the Northern Hemisphere by one season as we intensify deeper into this?
Well, very interesting question, because
what do you feel on that?
Historically, the Southern Hemisphere, in terms of the ending of ice age, is always led. And what has happened then is you get the cooling of the Southern Ocean for various reasons, and then after that, and that's a general cooling in the Southern Hemisphere as well, and after that you get a change in circulation in the Atlantic, which makes it rapidly colder in Europe. I'm not sure how the Pacific acts on this. It presumably has to also change, but the Atlantic seems to go through abrupt changes, and that is in fact what's been happening this year. I mean, there's been really rapid declines in various incredible stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's just
incredible, isn't it? How fast
it's
dropping.
Now, this isn't...
It's unbelievable. It's just dark blue now.
It's difficult to argue it's to do with atmospheric cooling. It's more to do with direct links between the sun and solar activity, solar activity, and the oceans and circulation. So, however it's working, it is, you know, temperatures of various parts of the North Atlantic and the hurricane belt Atlantic are dropping fast. And the actual direction of currents is changing, or the strength of them. I mean, there's one north of Norway, a current which feeds into the Arctic, you see, and that does follow to a reasonable extent geomagnetic activity, i.e. when geomagnetic activity is high, then you get this current which sends relatively milder water into the Arctic. That turns down, and that's the situation we're in now. But we've got some presentations. I think the latest one is not up yet, but it will be, and in that I show some things about which other people have found out about the direct connections between solar activity and changes in ocean currents, which is really, I think, highly significant. And it's an electrical connection because the sea is a weak conductor. So, magnetic fields around it will induce electric, or rather currents, yes, electric currents in the sea, and other sorts of currents will follow.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on the hurricanes too. Did you see that they have downgraded this season now because the waters are not producing? So suddenly they're downgrading it, but what you just referred to is the IPCC stated for sure that every single hurricane season from this point forward will be more intense, and now they're downgrading the number of storms. And it's unbelievable how they can downgrade, and then during the forecast, I thought the forecast was the forecast before the season started, and now in mid-roll they're like, we're going to downgrade it so we look like we're calling on the money at the end of the season, and they do that routinely year after year.
They're downgraded forecasts. No, if they looked at our website, they'd know what actually is happening. I mean, I think they got the idea of more extremes from us, because we made it very clear when I was speaking in a commodities conference in Geneva about 3 years ago. I made it very clear that there will be more extremes, there will be a wild jet stream, there will be a lot more increase of giant hail, and so forth, a whole list of things which they probably read and thought, oh, that's a good idea, let's just say we're going to have more extremes, and they just carry on repeating it, even though it's the wrong type of extremes. And this is used purely to brainwash people, and I think the scientists involved in promoting man-made climate change are an utter disgrace to science. They should be brought to account, because the consequences of what they do actually kills people. I mean, the increase in food prices, that is going to cause some amount of starvation. But the general thing is the increase in energy prices is causing energy poverty. 12 million people a year die of energy poverty. Now, that is a huge number. 12 million people. Well, it's 2 times 6 million, which is the sort of Holocaust numbers. That is a huge number of people. Now, they're probably not all dying directly from increases in price of energy. There's all sorts of distribution issues, I dare say. But, generally people die of cold, not of heat. When children are cold or old people are cold, they will die when the electricity prices are too high. So these deaths are on the hands of these people propagating this complete nonsense, and they need to examine their consciences.
It's not that it was some developing nation where you're talking about these poverty deaths occurring somewhere deep Africa. What happened with all the people who died in the UK this year? It was the worst winter in 42 years. They had 12,000 people die of cold there. That's ridiculous.
They might mention electricity prices in passing, or the government not being quick enough to hand out money. Well, of course, actually, the government has got a definite amount of handout, and that's it. The pointer has to be to the climate policies. But generally speaking, people go on jumping up and down about saving the planet, but they're not saving the people on the planet, that's for sure. And they're not saving the planet from anything anyway. It's delusionary nonsense.
And I'll agree, it's cyclical too. And you want to talk about the Arctic sea ice this year. That same current system that you referred to is pushing cooler water under the ice cap. That's the reason there's an enormous amount of ice up this year. And from this year forward, that is going to increase. That summer ice is going to last longer. It's going to be thicker. And when it covers up faster, it's going to send different wind patterns across the U.S. and across Europe. And we're going to get some devastating blizzards and cold events coming. The grid could go down during this term, Things are very cyclically happening, but they never want to talk about the cycles.
We've got a good understanding of the 60-year cycle, which is followed by the amplitude of winds and most extreme events, and also their actual levels. And American data follows this 60-year cycle quite explicitly, and you can see it on the data sets when they're plotted out. And we can explain this. There's a beat between the 22-year magnetic cycle of the sun and the 9.3-year half cycle of the lunar nodal rotation. That is the plane of rotation of the moon rotates backwards and does a complete circle relative to the stars in 18.6 years. So that means every 9.3 years the the direction of the nodes will be exactly pointing towards the sun, for example, not towards the sun, but to any particular direction in space, which is really quite significant. There's many other cycles which we can use and understand, and these enable us to choose in the past when similar Sun-Earth magnetic lunar modulated weather states were happening and similar to some time in the future, so we can use that weather in the past. Now, it's not simple as that because there's modifications we have to make, but we've got a better understanding now of the red weather periods, as we call them. Every weather period is numbered R1, R2, R3, R4, R5, and the highest being an R5. And in these R5s, you will get more geomagnetic activity and normally more activity in the solar wind, and there'll be more sunspots and so forth. And we've got, for your information, some very interesting findings on this only recently. In the last R5 period, July the 28th to August the 1st, give or take a day, we predicted there would be these various things happening in the solar wind and geomagnetic activity, and explicitly there would have been a big increase in hail, thunderstorms, tropical storm or cyclonic formation and so forth. Now, all of those things happened extremely well, and there were 360,000 lightning strikes in Europe on August the 1st to 2nd, for example, which is an astounding number. However, the amazing thing is, when you looked at the solar wind data, there was very little going on, absolutely very little indeed. I mean, not anything that you could describe as suddenly severe. And the same with the geomagnetic activity. There was no big news at all. But nevertheless, this R5 period worked. So there must be other things going on apart from what we usually see. And our conclusion is that this is the electric currents in space, namely what under the electric universe model of the solar system, you have what we call Birkeland currents. These are pairs of currents side by side which are twisted around each other and also involve a magnetic field in the same direction. And these will forcing factors, or they will force things to happen on the Earth. And these Birkeland currents will connect from the Sun to the polar regions of the Earth and also the other planets. And there'll be Birkeland currents going in and out of the North Pole and in and out of the South Pole, depending on polarities and so forth. But it would seem to me that what's actually happened is we've had a sudden strengthening of Birkeland currents during these R5 and R4 periods, which is driving these events. So there's a lot of stuff which is not obvious, and it's only through understanding that we're going to get even better forecasts. And it will probably help us do our Australian forecast. Well, I hope so when we understand this a bit better.
For those of you listening who do, so these are called also field-aligned currents, and they're driving in on our poles. Yeah, same one. Now, see, here's the thing. That sun, that big star that's over to the left of our planet, that thing is 1.2 million times larger than our Earth, and it's electromagnetically connected to us. Do you think the poles just kind of, our magnetic field just kind of wanders off into space and it doesn't connect to anything, and it's just out there and it's just like drifting off? Are you kidding me? That star drives our electric field on this planet. And we talk about the solar wind decreasing in the grand solar minimum. It's going to go below 40% here. It's going to drop below 40%. Sunspot looking at 50 over solar cycle 25 or under. And then solar cycle 26, it might not even be one. It might be below 25 sunspots. It might even be a no-show for sure, mon or minimum kind. But what's going to happen when we get, reduced greatly solar winds and reduced greatly sunspot numbers? I mean, you got to go back 400 years to look for something like this in a repeating cycle. And then you need to ask yourself, Is it a heavier, more intense cycle that's going to override what we consider 400-year cycles? Would it be a culmination of 5 of those, which would be literally a more heavy, more powerful cycle that's going to override? Or where are we in all these mechanisms like a clock? You know, when you look in a clock, you have the smaller gears or the larger gears. Where, you know, and these are the kind of questions I go for because our food is going to be affected.
Yeah, the mainstream media are pointing people in the wrong direction. They're saying the main fear is heat, and of course that isn't going to be a big problem for agriculture. In general terms, the big problem for agriculture is going to be shorter growing seasons and cold, and that is in fact what's happening. I mean, in England, you see now, we had a very short growing season. Now, it was fortuitous that it was good enough, because what happened, we basically had a switch from winter straight into summer. The spring hardly existed. So everything was late starting, but because it got so hot so quickly, the wheat and so forth grew very fast and was harvestable even on time or early, which is astounding. But I would say fortuitous, because not every summer in the general scheme of things, in the Maunder type minimum we're heading for, or Dalton type minimum, or even a worse type minimum, they're not going to be warm, because it depends a lot on the details of the jet stream. In fact, at the same time as the warm in Western Europe, we've had extreme cold in Russia, you see. So their crops didn't do well at all.